Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel very privileged to be here and to share some of my clinical and research and community-based knowledge with your students and staff today. So we are going to talk about coercive control, understanding the nature of coercive control, and you will understand why I called it walking on eggshells. So we're going to talk about challenges and tips in migrant and refugee communities. So the three things I want to cover is that we're going to talk about what is a metaphor of fragility, extreme sense of fragility inside, which is like a constant fear and hypervigilance that the victims experience in coercive control relationships. We are going to speak more about what actually coercive control is and highlight the psychological tactics beyond physical violence that underpin domestic abuse and how to treat them or manage them, and then raising awareness so that not only that the health professionals are informed, but also the wider society learns about the hidden dynamics of coercive control, because that is how we can stop this from happening. You all have heard about this story of Hannah Clark and how a teenage romance became a controlling, sexually abusive nightmare, ending in ghastly, ghastly murder and suicide of Hannah, her children, and himself. We were lucky to get to hear something about the internal story of what Hannah went through. And most importantly, her mother said she never disclosed anything of physical violence. Maybe she had, maybe she hadn't. And her former partner had attempted to regulate every aspect of her life, what she wore, what she ate, her access to medical care, social media accounts, and he'd been stalking her online. He would often tell her she's a useless mother. He'd pick on her and say she was fat, constantly putting her down. If she would dress up to go somewhere, he would tell her she looked terrible. He never looked her to look nice. So, what does that tell us? It tells us it's a story of extreme control, of psychological abuse, eventually leading to tragic outcome. So, why walking on eggshells? He's a husband, the middle-aged husband, maybe 40 years of marriage, comes home. Here are some flowers for you, darling. I love you, he says. Might have been her birthday. And she is enjoying the moment. Next moment, he says, why is there dust on the lamp? You're incapable. Fix it. So when the moment of love suddenly turns into a moment of fear, that is what the victim is living with. So, why does coercive control happen? It is particularly prevalent in relationships where there is an imbalance of power. The second thing to note is that it is a gendered crime. That is, more commonly, the victim survivor are women. They are also dependent on their perpetrator for reasons of old age, children, young people, and being disabled, or financial circumstances, migration related cultural stress issues, and visa related dependence. And how, why, what? There's fragile peace. Victims live in a cycle of love bombing and sudden outbursts of control and abuse. There's hypervigilance. So if you put yourself in the shoes of the victim, what is the victim trying to do? The victim is trying to go into a survival mode, which means always looking out for the threat to her life. And therefore, the victim is continuously hyper alert and hyper vigilant and looking continuously on his face, in his eyes, to see what the abuser's mood is going to be like and trying to prevent the explosion to maintain the safety. The worst part about it is an invisible trauma, unlike physical violence. The constant fear weaves into the identity of the person, eroding confidence and autonomy, and it changes her personality. So, little bit more what is coercive control. When two people are fighting in a relationship, it's not coercive control. Coercive control is not like an ordinary couple fight. It is a couple fight is an ordinary argument which aims to settle differences between the two people and in that process improves the relationship. A fight or an argument is not associated with threat of violence or intimidation or fear. Coercive behavior in a relationship is made up of intimidation and threats that aim to create a terrorizing state supported by controlling behavior. Control over the victim's life by tactics such as isolation renders her powerless over her own life. Privation of resources and limiting victims' choices and decision making create a prison like situation. Long time ago, in 1981, in a city in Minnesota, USA, called Duluth, a number of women, battered women, sat around having therapy. And from that knowledge and since then evolving knowledge came out this Duluth power and control wheel. If you haven't seen it before, Google it and have a look at it. And it truly describes to you how that power and control that sits in the middle of that wheel is used to convey all kinds of threats, fear, control, intimidation, and also using children and economical abuse. So the core tactics the Duluth Power and Control Wheel identified was firstly emotional abuse, which is undermining self-esteem through insults, belittling, humiliation. Male privilege, acting like the king of the castle, making unilateral decisions without recognizing the impact it's going to have on the other person, and economic abuse, which I will talk more about in another slide, but mostly it's about restricting access to money or resources to create dependence or cheating her of her own hard-earned money. And so what are the kinds of emotional abuse and threats? Verbal degradation, lowering self-worth, which then enforces submission. Threats intimidation create fear to gain compliance without physical violence. This is where people get very confused. I mean, the victim survivor in that situation as to what is happening to her. I just want to, I'll highlight again that I am using gendered language because we must not forget the majority victims are women, and that this coercive control legislation I'll speak about shortly is going to create quite a lot of misidentified perpetrators of women. Gaslighting, which is an unbelievable form of mental cruelty in which the perpetrator is able to undermine the victim's sense of reality, leading to confusion and self doubt and doubting her judgment, which initially starts happening in a home or a relationship situation, but extends to the outside world and work. And these are some of the tactics of control, which is isolation tactics, cutting off victims from the family, friends, and support network. Surveillance, which is through monitoring phones, emails, and movements to maintain control. And so the tech abuse here has become a major form of coercive control now. And the final one is the financial abuse. So, what is financial abuse? Because it is the commonest form of coercive control. It is about using their own or shared money without consent, or making important financial decisions without consulting, controlling all of the household income, limiting their partner's access to bank accounts, hiding money or assets, forcing or pressuring their partner to spend money or sell property, limiting their ability to find and maintain employment, accruing and refusing to pay debts, dowry, something that some of you might have heard about. It is a cultural expression of financial demands, financial coercion to pay money gifts in the context of a marriage and migration. And lack of compliance with dowry will be met with emotional, psychological, physical, and other forms of abuse. What are the steps in developing coercive control? The first step is love bombing, where there is an initial phase of charm and intense affection to build trust. And in this situation, the perpetrator often becomes jealous. But this is the amazing gaslighting that in that context, the jealousy is construed by the perpetrator as a normal behavior, expression of love, and the victim becomes very confused. Isolation from support networks is a second step. So once the relationship is committed, controlling behavior start, and there's gradual separation from support networks, which then leads to not only erosion of confidence, but also extreme vulnerability because the woman has nowhere else to go for help. And the third step, undermining the confidence. You don't look good. You're not intelligent. You're not capable. You don't know how to clean the house. The fourth step is fear induction with credible threats of violence interspersed with actual physical violence. Some start to dissociate from that fear because you cannot live with that fear. And so you start to disconnect from part of your brain that is feeling the fear. And I will describe to you the neuroscience of fear later. The fifth step is micromanaging. So, what the victim tries to do is to try to control so try to actually hear and anticipate what he's saying and what he's trying to control. For example, he's trying to control what she wears, who she goes out, where to work, control the money, demand dowry with threats. So she is in constant state of fear, criticism, humiliation, and unpredictability, but she is also trying to manage this whole situation. So the micromanagement is happening two ways, from him towards her and her towards him to keep her safe. Gaslighting confusing her, making her lose confidence in her own judgment, and she's now unable to trust herself, lost self-confidence and self-worth, and now she's trapped and in a constant state of fear, hypervigilance, and stress. The paper that I didn't put in here was by research by Moncton that shows there are 8 steps before before the perpetrator commits homicide using the coercive control. So you can have a look at that. I have put that reference in. So I just want to talk about migrant and refugee women because that is what this seminar is about. So the migrant women, there was a research that was conducted by Monash University, and it showed that migrant women in COVID lockdowns suffered a lot of coercive control because it locked the victim with their perpetrator, and that amplified the tactics of coercive control. So the first thing was increased isolation. And so the victim has migrated away from support networks, but lockdown further isolates the victim from networks within the society community, and that allowed the perpetrators to intensify further the control and the micromanagement. And the second problem the migrant women faced was the barriers to seeking help, facing language barriers, cultural barriers, legal obstacles to seeking support that meant that they were trapped. And exploitation of circumstances, the perpetrators used the COVID restrictions to control movements and cut off the resources, and threats to sponsorship of the visa and or temporary visa, putting that at risk. So Australian femicide data from the New South Wales Domestic Violence Death Review showed that 90% of murdered women experience coercive control before murder. That separation is the most dangerous time because the perpetrator loses control and murder is the final control. And this came from the New South Wales State Coroner's Court 2020 Death Review. Reminder once again, it's a gendered crime. 1 in 3 women globally report facing family violence comprising emotional, physical, sexual, and financial abuse. This is an epidemic proportion. No country, community, or social class is exempt. 1 to 2 women per week are killed in Australia by a former or current partner, and most sadly, according to the Red Heart campaign in 2024, 104 women were killed by a former current partner. In 2025, 37 have been killed. So actually, sorry, that's 104 women and children. And in 25, 37 have been killed so far. And previously, the homicide rate was traveling around 1 per week, and this is much more than that. And just to remind you that this has been going on, attempt to stop domestic violence in some form has been going on since 1995. So in 93, domestic violence was recognized as a human rights issue, and the adoption of the Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women by the UN General Assembly. In 95, Beijing Declaration actually adopted that, and it was a moment of significant public shift in acknowledgement of domestic violence as a human rights abuse. In summary, coercive control is a pattern of controlling, dominating, manipulative behaviors that strip a person of their autonomy and sense of self. Unlike physical violence, coercive control is often hidden, insidious, prolonged, and it includes intimidation, isolation, surveillance, micromanagement, daily activities, financial abuse, and threats. And it's recognized in many jurisdictions as a form of domestic family violence And coercive control presents unique challenges for social workers and counselors in assessment, intervention, and advocacy. So the definition and legislative gaps, there are many in current legislations, and this was why Attorney General issued a paper in 2024 called the National Principles of Coercive Control that gives guidance to states and service providers across the country. If you haven't read it, please do. And so New South Wales initiated the hearing whether or not to legislate coercive control before even that paper in 2021. And then in 2025, it was passed, the bill was passed to be implemented, but it's a very complex piece of legislation and it will need a lot of ongoing training of the police professionals and the community, and the pushback by Queensland Police is going on. They are saying that it is not their job, it is the domestic violence service provider's job. What are the impacts on mental health? The victim survivors suffer from long-term chronic conditions such as PTSD, major depressive illness, eating disorder, substance use, chronic pain, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder. There is growing evidence base of the short and long-term physical, mental, sexual, and reproductive health outcomes from experiencing family violence across one's lifespan. You won't be able to read it, but just want to show you that this was produced by the WHO, and it shows how intimate partner violence gives rise to physical trauma, injury, and death, disability and death, psychological trauma, stress, and mental health problems, substance use, and non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease, hypertension, somatoform diseases like irritable bowel, chronic pain. And the important point is the fear and control, ongoing fear and control leads to all kinds of outcomes. For example, limited sexual and reproductive control, perinatal maternal health is damaged, the baby suffers, the fetus suffers, the newborn suffers, the healthcare seeking is interfered, and sexual and reproductive health caring is interfered by. So presentations can be anxiety, depression, drug, alcohol, chronic headache, diarrhea, sleeping, eating disorders, and physical injuries, and suicidal feelings. So when there are unconvincing explanations, think coercive control. And so there is 7 times greater risk of PTSD, 3 times greater risk of major depressive illness, 4 times greater risk of anxiety and panic disorder. And in an Australian population study, suicidal behavior increased 3 times compared to general population and other mental disorders, and it was dose related. More domestic violence leads to more suicidality. And so the texture of fear is woven into the personhood of the victim, which then makes it very hard to regain confidence and confidence in social judgment and lower self-worth. And this is what changes the personality. And so there is something called complex PTSD. So the PTSD we know is produced by is formulation defined by DSM-4, and there are 3 core elements: re-experiencing of traumatic event, avoidance of traumatic reminders, and a sense of current threat. Whereas complex PTSD includes additional disturbances that have been validated, which is emotional regulation becomes difficult, hard to calm down, and emotional numbing. The self identity, negative self perception as a failure and self blame, and relational capacity, inability to trust and avoid relationships. Just want to describe to you the neuroscience of fear. So we have a defense system that is designed to protect us, and that's fear and aggression and fright and so on. And then we have a second system called the attachment system, where the child and anybody wants to be loved and be attached. So if you are being attacked and there is fear and there is threat to your life, and then you have an equal and opposite need for love and attention, that tears you apart. And this is what causes people to dissociate, because then one part of the brain stops talking to another part of the brain. And so, um, sorry, there's something happening here. So, what are the key challenges for migrants and refugees? The first is invisibility and minimization by the victim survivor. And they often can't tell whether it is love or whether it is control or it is abuse. There are complex chronic patterns that are hard to document even for the observer, let alone the victim survivor. There are significant mental health impacts on the migrant or refugee women. Risk assessment may overlook non physical abuse, and then there are the legal and systemic barriers. So, what are the tips? Safety planning. Develop survivor led plans, respect their knowledge of the perpetrator and behavior. Believe the survivor. Explain that coercive control is real and harmful. Avoid blame. Ask the right questions. Do you feel fear to see your friends and family? Does your partner monitor your actions? Can you make decisions independently? Document the patterns. Keep detailed notes showing ongoing control, not just incident. It will help in legal context. Connect and advocate. Link with specialists, domestic violence, legal, mental health services, and advocate for policy change and public awareness. And be trauma informed. Understand repeated returns are about survival. Empower informed choices. In summary, social workers/counselors play a vital role in recognizing coercive control and supporting survivor with skill, compassion, and advocacy. The treatment must have an intersectional lens and cultural sensitivity. A complete risk assessment using Victorian MARAMs can be done. A treatment of the mental condition should be followed as per the standard guidelines. And if the mental condition or suicidality is a significant issue, admit to the hospital. If not, admit to a safe house. If you're worried, contact the specialist family violence services, and always share information and collaborate to make safety planning, safety plans, and make sure the victim survivor stays engaged in their services. And these are your references. Some national, the helpful numbers that you all know. And thank you for listening.